So this first lesson is going to be about ecosystems, and the learning target is to know the basic aspects of an ecosystem. Things like the abiotic factors, the biotic factors, the niche, the habitat, competitive exclusion, and how all of these relate to one another in an ecosystem. So during this unit on ecosystems, we're really going to be talking about this big idea of ecology, which is how living things interact with each other and the environment. And this is the main idea of what we're studying here, and we're going to break it down into three main parts. I'm going to write populations here. But what we're really looking at is how do we identify these different parts of an ecosystem? Things like the rocks, the trees, the organisms, and how do we classify all of these different parts? Just like what are the basic building blocks of an ecosystem? We're not really going to deal with the interactions in that part. We're just looking at how do we identify what do we have here to work with. And then the other part of this, it is going to come up a little bit in the populations, but what are the interactions between all of these different parts of the ecosystems, or these different pieces that make up the entire ecosystem? How do the rocks interact with the animals, and how do the trees interact with the other organisms in there? So how are these organisms interacting with one another? And the last part of this is how does energy play a role in this, right? How does energy get into the ecosystem? How does it transfer throughout the ecosystem? And then where does energy go throughout the ecosystem? And being able to track that energy throughout the entire ecosystem and see how it affects the overall system of the ecosystem. And all of these are going to be playing with each other the whole time. I mean, we're going to be seeing how the populations are affected by the interactions between the organisms and how energy plays a role in that. So these are all three going to go together, but these are the main tenets of this ecology unit. And then when we get done with that, we're going to be really diving into how can humans affect each of these parts of ecology, and how do humans change the system of an ecosystem, and how do they change the inputs and the outputs of this ecosystem, and how does an ecosystem need to adapt to overcome the challenges that are presented with the humans, and how can humans positively affect these ecosystems? And so that's really what this whole unit is going to be about. And so as we get into the ecosystem unit here, we're going to define an ecosystem as a unit of nature. Right? And a unit can be a lot of different scales. I mean, it could be a really big scale. It could be, the size of a whole region. It could be on a smaller scale where it's the size of a forest, or it could be even on an even smaller scale where it's the size of, maybe a downed tree log is an ecosystem. But an ecosystem consists of all the biotic factors, and this means living, things like the trees, the plants, the animals, all the living parts of the ecosystem. And we can have the abiotic factors, which are the non-living parts of the ecosystem. Right? And so if we look at this ecosystem up here, we have our biotic and we have our abiotic factors. We have the zebras and the giraffes and the elephants, which are biotic factors. We have the plants and we have the trees, which are biotic factors. We probably have some organisms living down in the soil, and we have some organisms living in the water. And we also have our abiotic factors, which is the air, the temperature, the water, and so all of those factors together contribute to the overall ecosystem. And we can zoom this in on a different scale. If we looked at just the water ecosystem, this looks very different than when we zoom out and we see everything at a larger scale. And we could zoom in to a smaller part of the tree. Maybe just inside this one tree, there's a micro ecosystem where we have the smaller organisms, and we have maybe some little bugs and things that are living in there, and they interact with the same principles as the larger ecosystem, but on a smaller scale. And so being able to define the unit of our ecosystem is really important throughout this unit, because that's gonna tell us, how we think about the system and how we track the inputs and the outputs of the system, because there's things coming into this ecosystem and there's things going out of this ecosystem, and seeing how those interact with each other will be a big part of this unit. And so as we start looking at ecosystems, we're going to be coming up with ideas on what the roles of these different organisms could be. For example, each one of these could be up in that treetop ecosystem in the last slide that we talked about, but they each play a very different role in that ecosystem. For example, this toucan here has a very different role than this little bug has, and it's based off of their properties, right? This guy is very small, has 6 legs. This guy here has a big long beak and some wings, and so they're going to have very different jobs in this ecosystem because they're going to be able to do different things. And the role that they have in their ecosystem is called a niche. That's the role that they play. And this is really how they interact with their environment. And a lot of it is going to be based off of the different properties that they have and the different, structures that they have on their body, right? If you have little wings and antennas, you're going to be able to do different things than a bird that has a big long beak. Or if you have a long tail and you can jump from tree to tree, you're going to be able to do different things than a little bug. And so that role is going to depend on their function. And you're going to be thinking about that as you go through your ecosystem that you're studying and trying to decide what each organism or each part of that ecosystem's role is in the ecosystem. And the other part of this is when we look at the ecosystem themselves. And the ecosystem, the habitat, is the physical environment that a species is adapted to. This is going to be physical environment that they are adapted to and that they're living in. So this could be things like the temperature, the rainfall. What do the trees look like around there, right? This guy is not going to be living out in a desert. And so the habitat makes a big difference in the way that they interact with their environment based off of their niche, the structures on their body that make up how they can interact with their environment. So those are two things that you're going to be thinking about as you're going through your own ecosystem. What is the physical environment that makes up this ecosystem, and how does this lend itself to the organisms that live in this ecosystem, and what structures on these organisms allow them to interact in a positive way with their ecosystem and make them perfectly suited for the ecosystem they live in and the role that they take on in that ecosystem, the niche and the habitat that they live in. So as we look at the roles that different organisms play in their ecosystems, there's one principle that we need to talk about, and it's called competitive exclusion. And it's going to help to identify some of these roles that different organisms play in an ecosystem. The competitive exclusion states that two organisms can't occupy the same niche for very long. And so if we have two, let's say we had two apex predators in the same ecosystem. Well, they wouldn't last very long in the same ecosystem because they would occupy the same niche. They'd constantly be going at each other's throats, competing for the same resources, and it just wouldn't work out very well. And so one would either have to move on because it would get outcompeted by for the other one, or they would be in fights constantly, and one wouldn't make it. And so when I saw this picture, I thought, why are crocodiles spending so much time around hippos? Like these both, I've heard they're both, kind of aggressive. They both kill people. They both can be very dangerous, but they're operating right next to each other. And honestly, I think the crocodiles could feed on a hippo if hippos weren't so dangerous. Now, they're both very dangerous organisms, but they operate and they occupy different niches. These are carnivores, and the hippos are herbivores, meaning they only eat plants. So as they're occupying the same ecosystem around this pond, this lake, or whatever this is, they're not competing for the same resources. The alligators are looking for something to eat that's living, and the hippos are looking to eat something that's maybe green and doesn't move so fast. So because they have very different roles with each other in their ecosystems, and their roles really don't overlap with each other, they can occupy the same ecosystem together because of how different their niches are, and they're not competing with each other. And so this is another principle that you should be thinking about as you're looking through your ecosystems and trying to see, okay, I have to make sure that I don't have too many organisms that occupy the exact same niche in an ecosystem. So what are the little differences between these organisms that allow them to operate in the same space with each other and in a positive way? So the goal for you in this video was to understand the basic ideas behind ecosystems. And so remember that as you're looking through your own ecosystem, because that's what you're going to be doing next, you're looking for the biotic factors, the living factors, the abiotic factors, and you should be thinking about, and you should be thinking about the niche and the habitat that each organism occupies in that ecosystem, and helping to give a prediction for what the purpose of that organism is in its ecosystem.